Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, thank you for joining One Neighborhood Builders for our monthly Fresh Friday series. I'm Allie Steinberg from One Neighborhood Builders. If you'd like to turn on captions for this webinar, you can do so, this discussion rather. So first click on captions at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see captions, you can click the more or the three dots icon. In the corner and then select captions, then choose your caption language and then click show captions. We're seeing some captions right now because of PowerPoint and to kind of bridge us to the Zoom captions if you need them or want them. But this is how you can turn on your captions. Um, my colleague Kyle McKendall will be placing some instructions on how to do that in the chat. So we launched this Fresh Friday series to create space for practitioners, community members, policymakers, and all other interested people to learn and share about community development, including something very important through mixed income housing and communities. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So before we get started, just a quick note on logistics for today. Please note that we will be recording this session as we intend to share it with interested individuals who are not able to join us this morning. Second, if you have questions or comments while one of our panelists is speaking, please feel free to leave it in the chat and we will try to incorporate it into the session. Towards the end of the session, we will have an open Q&A during which you'll have the floor to ask your own questions. Third, we want to remind you that if you hear a phrase or an acronym you aren't familiar with, we encourage you to ask about it in the chat. My colleague Kyle McKendall will be watching the chat and will jump in to explain as he's able. This is a space for learning, so we encourage you to use it as such. And fourth, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. So today we're going to hear from some incredible panelists who are working on mixed income development in Rhode Island and throughout the country. So Peter Asen is the freshly minted Director of Housing Production and Preservation at the Rhode Island Department of Housing, who is working to advance the state's Housing 2030 goals and liaise with developers in cities and towns to advance housing developments. Claudia Aiken is the Director of New Research Partnerships at the Housing Solutions Lab at the NYU Furman Center. Claudia and the Housing Solutions Lab engage jurisdictions across the country on their housing challenges and evaluate the impact of these jurisdictions' programs and policies. And Peter Chapman is the president and CEO here at One Neighborhood Builders, a nonprofit community development organization based in Providence, Rhode Island, that develops affordable housing throughout Rhode Island and convenes Central Providence Unidos, a health equity zone advancing health equity and economic mobility. Thank you all so much for being here. So now let's hear from our panel. So Claudia, first, can you give us like a 30,000-foot view? What does mixed income development mean? What incomes are we talking about? And what goals are the communities you're working with seeking to address through it?
Well, Allie, thanks first of all for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and part of this all-star panel, and excited to see some familiar names on the webinar this morning. But yeah, to give that 30,000-foot view, I would say that mixed income development typically means a single project that combines market rate units with a certain share of units whose rents have to be affordable to a given income group for a given period. They may also be income restricted, meaning that only low-income households who are eligible can live in those units. And this is different than maybe more European concepts of social mixing, which focus on just setting rents low enough and making housing attractive enough across the board, that social mixing is possible without actually tying the rents to incomes. So some early efforts to deliberately do this kind of mixed income development in the US included the Hope 6 program, which redeveloped public housing projects to include market rate units. And the goal there was really deconcentrating poverty. Hope 6 ultimately produced projects with a pretty broad range of income and tenure mixes. The program did draw criticism because it didn't replace those public housing units one for one. And so some deeply affordable units were lost. And because return rates to the redevelopment were pretty low. Subsequent federal programs have tried to kind of learn from these lessons. But Outside of federal mixed income policy, many communities across the country have now embraced this idea of inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, it's sometimes called, as a way to leverage private development to create affordable units, especially in desirable neighborhoods. This is something that we cover on our website, localhousingsolutions.org, and that we work directly with communities across the country to try to integrate into their housing strategies. The idea is really that private market rate developments have to include a set aside of affordable units, have to or are encouraged to through various kind of carrots and sticks. And many cities, towns, and counties establish these set-aside levels in the range of 10 to 20% of the total units of a development, but give developers a few different ways to meet that target. And there might be different kind of income targets within that set-aside. The policies can be mandatory, voluntary, they can apply only to certain neighborhoods or kinds of developments, and they really should be revisited very often to calibrate them to the housing market. We've learned some lessons over time about requiring affordable and market rate units in these buildings to be of the same quality and avoid this poor door phenomenon. And also not giving developers too much leeway to build those affordable units off-site or pay kind of in lieu fees instead of having to build those units themselves. And then I'll just really quickly add that another way that we're seeing mixed income housing crop up now, which is exciting, is in publicly driven development models like the one in Montgomery County, Maryland, where the Public Housing Authority develops a mixed income building using the market rate units to cross-subsidize the affordable rents and kind of retains ownership and profits from that building over the long term. In the case of Montgomery County, the affordability is really not that deep, and it very much depends on what the market can support. But I'll just end by saying that mixed income development takes many forms. The goals can be very different. I've mentioned deconcentrating poverty, creating affordability in high cost and high amenity neighborhoods, leveraging land value, and also cross-subsidization. So a whole range of things.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claudia. That's seeing there's a lot of different ways to do that model, and appreciate that history as well with the Hope Six. So now we're going to transition Peter Chapman. So you've worked in mixed income developments for 30 years. Why do you think mixed income developments are an effective community development strategy? And what are some of the components that make successful mixed income development?
Yeah, great question, Ali, and thank you for being the producer director extraordinaire as you always are with Fresh Fridays. I think Claudia's framing is an extremely good one, and she's touched upon some of the I think critically important elements of mixed income housing, and I would define mixed income housing the same way Claudia did. Right, it's the intentional, in many instances, blending of units for both market rate and LMI folks. There are really three benefits that I've seen as a practitioner over the last 25, 26 years of doing this work in the trenches. And a lot of this work has focused on Hope Six and more recently Choice Neighborhoods projects as both a practitioner, researcher, and consultant. But first is deconcentrating poverty, right? So what we've seen as practitioners, and a lot of this has been backed up by data, particularly over the last 10 or 12 years, is that concentrating people in communities of high poverty are associated with a lot of negative outcomes, right? So, high rates of unemployment, high rates of poverty, obviously limited access to opportunity. And so there's a fair amount of empirical data that we've seen in more recent years that has kind of confirmed that, right? And not to go too deep into this, but we can certainly talk more during Q&A. You have folks like Patrick Sharkey, who I think used to be at NYU, who did a really good piece of economic mobility work. More recently, Raj Chetty's work showing that economic mobility and limits to economic mobility are directly linked to where kids grow up, and that places that are most conducive or more conducive to upward mobility, show, they have, higher performing elementary schools, higher shares of households with two-parent families, and more residential integration, right, of affluent folks with middle income and lower income folks. So that's one big, very important rationale for supporting mixed income housing. Another is the ability of mixed income communities to attract economic development. And this is something that many of us who work in the affordable housing space, in the community development space, don't talk about enough. And that is, how do you attract primary employers to a community? How do you attract certain types of retail and amenities to a community? And it's easier when you can show data that confirms that you have critical mass of households across a broader income and socioeconomic spectrum. And then the third area is quite simply the opportunity for cross subsidy. And this is something that we wake up thinking about every day as a nonprofit affordable housing developer. And cross subsidy, quite simply, means that you are capturing the rental income from folks at the higher end of the spectrum, and you're using that revenue stream to help offset or subsidize folks who are at the lower end of the spectrum. So anyway, I don't want to ramble, but those are three critical, I think, very positive driving motivations for us to prioritize mixed income housing. And mixed income housing looks different, right, in every community and in every particular development or redevelopment scenario.
Awesome. Thank you so much for touching on why so many places are thinking about mixed income housing, but also how it's not a one size fits all model, as we heard before, really contextualizing it in that community and thinking about what makes sense there. Really appreciate that. So now turning to Peter Asen, how does mixed income housing currently exist in Rhode Island communities, and what tools are currently available to developers and municipalities to incentivize this type of development, and what barriers currently exist have you seen to creating this kind of housing in neighborhoods?
Thank you. So in terms of how it most commonly exists today, there for reasons that we could get into in terms of that relate to housing development finance, I think it's actually fairly challenging for to do substantial mixed income housing in low-income housing tax credit developments in a lot of cases. And if at least if you look at kind of the recent development within the state, it's fairly limited in terms of the number of developments that are pursuing that, even though we do have, say, in our qualified allocation plan, points for developments that have mixed income units and things like that, or non-affordable units. But with the just for example, I was just looking at the Rhode Island Housing dashboard of the SFRF, ARPA-funded projects. Only about 1/4 of those are not all affordable, and have some portion of market rate units. Another example was this past spring was the first time that the state has awarded funds through our new state low-income housing tax credit program, which basically is meant to help close a funding gap for projects that are receiving federal tax credits as well and need additional funding. There were 6 developments that we funded. The state's spent our $30 million on this program, funded 6 developments. There were 530 new units that are being partially funded through that program, as well as 30 preservation units. And of those 6 developments, there's only 6 units total that are market rate. There's another, I believe, 22 units or maybe 16 units that are above 80% as well. So the vast majority of the units we're supporting in those are affordable units. There's basically one project in Westerly that's integrating some other things. So I think it can show up and work well potentially in places where those market rate units can be very high rent amounts. Westerly being an example. Another example people may be familiar with is the new development that was just completed in the 195 or Fox Point area by Penrose, which does have some market rate as well as kind of middle income units. But that piece around cross subsidization, I think, is tricky because say you're talking about the tax credits, you cannot benefit from tax credit equity for portions of a development that are not affordable. So you really need to have the market rate rents have to be higher, enough higher, or a lot higher, basically, to get to the point where you're making up for the loss of those. And I think we have to be careful in terms of thinking about, from a policy standpoint, do we want to actually be subsidizing middle income or market rate units with the additional money that's made in or the additional equity brought about by affordable units, given a limited amount of resources on kind of to support affordable units. So that is where I think we should be thinking about more. Peter mentioned mixed income communities and economic development, that we should be thinking more about mixed income neighborhoods and not solely mixed income individual developments. One other quick thing I'll just mention is that where it does show up outside of that type of LIHTC context in the state, most commonly, I think, is through projects that are built using the comprehensive permit, which is complicated. I won't get into it too much, but in a majority of the communities across the state where we don't have at least 10% low moderate income housing now, the comprehensive permit's a tool that developers can use to more quickly get projects approved, and really puts limits on the ability of the municipality to stop the approval of projects to some very specific reasons. And in order to qualify for that, which it also is an inclusionary zoning type of policy because it allows for density bonuses. In order to qualify for the density bonus, you have to have at least 25% of the units affordable. So there's a lot of market rate developers that use that and say, I'm going to do the 25% affordable units. I'm going to then be able to get more density. And especially, say, people doing home ownership developments and things like that, they are taking advantage of that opportunity, which in those cases is incentivizing developers to include a smaller number of affordable units in a more predominantly mixed income development.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate the specific examples of what types of developments are getting approved, both on the affordable side that's incorporating the market rate and also the market rate that's incorporating the affordable. Really appreciate kind of those different models and how they're actually working in Rhode Island. And I really appreciate also the examples of the development in Westerly, the development in Providence, and also that specific comprehensive permit tool, which I know is something that is a lot of meaty details in there, but really interesting to think about how market rate developers are using that tool as well. That's really great to hear. And that's really helpful. So now I'm going to transition back to Claudia. So we talked a little bit, Peter, about incentives in Rhode Island. And so Claudia, can you give some examples of jurisdictions that have intentionally incentivized mixed income development? What's the impact been in those areas? We heard a bit about it from Peter Chapman. Would love to hear more from your experience.
Sure. So interesting about LIHTC. I didn't even cover that in my earlier answer. But in terms of inclusionary housing, more along the lines of the comprehensive permit, it sounds like this is something that is happening all over the country. An organization called Grounded Solutions actually tracks these programs, and it has counted at this point more than 900 jurisdictions across 25 states that have these kinds of programs. And some states actually mandate, excuse me, or incentivize localities to adopt inclusionary housing. So they're especially common in those states, including New Jersey, Massachusetts, and California. So at this point, we do have lots of evidence about what these programs can look like. And actually, back in 2010, some of my colleagues here at the Furman Center published a paper called 31 Flavors of Inclusionary Zoning. I love that title. Looking at how the structure of these programs varied. And they specifically looked at San Francisco, or the Bay Area, Washington, D.C., and Boston. And their research found that these programs are pretty complex and vary a lot from place to place, both in terms of the structure and the outcomes. So in the Bay Area, for example, those programs tended to be mandatory and applied pretty broadly across locations and structure types. But they really tried to soften any negative kind of impacts by giving developers density bonuses and other kinds of cost offsets. Whereas in the DC area, most of those programs, while also mandatory, had lots of exemptions for smaller developments, lower density housing types. Then in Boston, these programs really tended to be pretty voluntary. Measuring outcomes is hard. It can be really difficult to know what the counterfactual is. So basically, what would have happened if this policy wasn't in place? The outcome that most places try to track is just how many affordable units were created. And many policies have produced lots of units at this point, especially ones that have been around for a long time. So the example that everyone likes to give, the longest running program in the country, again in Montgomery County, Maryland, dates back to 1976. Now they have more than 17,000 rental and for sale, what they call MPDUs. These are their set aside units. Whereas other communities really have struggled to see similar results. It seems to depend quite a bit on just how much development is occurring and how carefully the policy is crafted to take advantage of that without stifling it. So the evidence on that is really mixed. Lance Freeman and Jenny Schutz back in 2017 concluded that most programs have produced pretty small numbers of units, but other studies have been more encouraging. And what I like to say generally is that we need to think about what the outcome is. And when I'm talking to communities, I'm usually not framing inclusionary housing as a way to produce tons of affordable units. In my mind, it's not that. It's a way of, at pretty low cost, maybe creating some affordable units in neighborhoods that are desirable, have lots of amenities, have opportunities that low-income households otherwise might not be able to access.
Really appreciate that, Claudia, and thanks for dropping some studies that have been done. I tried to capture one of those 31 flavors, but if you have any other studies that you think people should read, would appreciate your putting those in the chat, or we can send them out after. So really appreciate that, because definitely there's been a lot, we've been talking about this for a while, and also appreciate that what is the policy goal here? And with inclusionary zoning, one of the tools to incentivize mixed income development is to kind of create access to affordable housing in these high opportunity neighborhoods. So really appreciate that. So Peter Chapman, so One Neighborhood Builders Housing has been 100% affordable housing for households earning less than 80% of the area median income for rental and less than 20% of the area median income for sale homes, as is determined by Rhode Island state law. So how do the tools and strategies One Neighborhood Builders and similar developers use look different for 100% affordable than when looking at mixed income? How do those tools look different? We've talked about a few of them, but curious your perspective.
Yeah, so One Neighborhood Builders, as we all know, has done a phenomenal job of maximizing the tools available to it as a development corporation, in particular the low-income housing tax credit, which the other Peter, my friend Peter Asen, talked about. And that's very logical, because the low-income housing tax credit, in terms of federal housing policy, helps to finance literally about 90% of affordable housing in this country. And so we are looking at two approaches going forward. How do we continue to maximize that resource? Not so much the 9% or the more competitive tax credit, but the less competitive or non-competitive tax credit, the 4% program, while also developing a financial model, or I should say financial models, that look at creating mixed income models that don't use LIHTC at all. Again, so, we are not looking to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater, but if we are going to really be data driven and figure out how we create mixed income communities, but also mixed income projects. And it's been done, right, over the last, several decades in other communities very effectively. We have to come up with new financial models. And so I'm not going to get deep into into that particular aspect of our work because it's ongoing. We look forward to having a robust conversation with our board about these models in September. But I do want to take a moment to highlight another area of policy that has demonstrated the importance and the effectiveness of mixed income housing. I'm glad that Claudia mentioned Montgomery County, which is an IZO model that goes back several decades. We've also talked about the Hope 6 and Choice Neighborhoods model, but there is another program that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's the Mitchell-Lama program in New York State, which has been in existence since the 1950s. And the Mitchell-Lama program has been particularly effective at creating mixed income buildings, mixed income projects, and mixed income communities using not just or incentivizing not just affordable rental housing, but affordable and mixed income cooperative housing, which for the non-housing people on this webinar is really a hybrid between rental housing and home ownership, right? So instead of owning the unit outright, as you do in traditional home ownership, you own a share in the corporation that owns the housing. So that has given a lot of low and middle income people the opportunity to achieve some equity stake in their housing in New York City and in New York State. It's been a phenomenal model. I'm under no delusion that we can replicate that sort of model today, but it bears further research and understanding among those who are engaged in affordable housing development, mixed income housing development, and housing policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate those examples from around the country that are working on this. And that there's other tools. I think we've heard a lot that the expansion of LIHTC and how LIHTC is a real tool for 90% of affordable housing, and thinking about what other tools are out there so that LIHTC's not trying to do everything. So appreciate that. So our last question before we go to our open Q&A, so get your questions ready, is for Peter Asen. So Peter, what opportunities are coming up for people in Rhode Island to look at, or other states to look at what Rhode Island's doing to advance mixed income housing in neighborhoods? I know there's some stuff coming up.
Thank you. I just want to, I'm sure most folks here probably have heard about the Housing 2030 plan that the department issued a draft of in April. We had a public comment period. The draft plan is still available on our website, and we're working over the next few months to have a final version of that plan. But I think it won't look too different from the draft plan that's there. We're just trying to make some adjustments based on the comments we received. So I do encourage people to look at that because I think that's going to drive a lot of what we're going to be doing. I do want to just highlight the fact, our Secretary Goddard, who I work for, likes to talk about the fact that she really wants to, the plan does assume that the urban core communities, or the communities with the most jobs and public transit, are going to do the most growth, but the plan does have goals of growth and new housing permitted in all 39 cities and towns across the state. And she really does, from a fair housing standpoint, want to be able to see the state where people can live, in any community in Rhode Island, or have the opportunity to live across the state. So that's where I think that mixed income communities piece, and where we have priorities potentially to try to support more affordable housing in those communities that have not reached the 10%, is something that we're going to definitely be looking at. We're also seeking to do 1,000 homeownership units at under $400,000 across the state over the next 5 years, which is another piece of creating that opportunity around homeownership for low and moderate income households. So we have the voters in November passed a $120 million housing bond, which, in this time with uncertainty about federal funding, the importance of the state having its own resources to put into housing is that much greater. And this is the biggest housing bond that Rhode Island's ever had. We have a lot of those funds. We're hoping to kind of start to get out opportunities around those in the next couple of months or next 6 months. I think with a lot of those, there's going to be opportunities and ways we'll be looking at in the programs, how we want to encourage and support mixed income developments and mixed income communities. I know Claudia's organization worked with the state on studying the public development piece, in that we do have plans for $10 million of the bond funds to go towards a new public development program. We just had a meeting with the Public Housing Association yesterday about that, getting their input. And there's going to be some funding for acquisition of blighted properties, redevelopment of blighted properties, acquisition more generally, to help those who are doing affordable housing be able to do that. So there's going to be a lot coming with that in the coming months, and people should definitely keep their eyes open for those opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. Great to know what's coming down the pike. So thank you all, Peter, and Claudia. So for this final 12 minutes we have together, let's open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand using the react and then raise hand function, or put your question in the chat. And yeah, thank you. Please feel free. Oh, I see one question in the chat from Ryan, and then we'll go to Tina. Has anyone encountered challenges in mixed income ownership projects with unaffordable HOA, home ownership association, dues and special assessments for the affordable and shared equity units? Any suggestions for how to ensure those costs are fairly distributed? Anyone want to take that one?
I was just going to quickly mention, I know Representative Speakman I saw was on the call today. I know that she has legislation that I've heard her speak about that's seeking to address that issue. I know it wasn't on the HOA piece specifically. And that comes up, especially I mentioned before, the comprehensive permit issue. You could have, in another context, but you could have a condo development where a quarter of the units are affordable, the other 3/4 are not. And when you have a vote of the condo membership to raise dues for something, that group of folks who are more income, lower income, are not going to have the majority of the votes, and are going to be impacted differently. So it is, I think that's a complicated, difficult issue, and I'm glad that there are folks in the Assembly that are looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Yes, and Rep. Speakman said, we'll try again next year. Any guidance is welcome. Yes, I know that was a discussion at the June Housing Affordability Commission. So definitely on everybody's minds. Tina, you have the floor.
Yes, good morning, everybody. With our aging population and 55% of Rhode Islanders using a mobility aid, I'm not hearing anybody talking about affordable, fully accessible housing. We just built a housing complex in Jamestown, which was great. It's accessible. It's for people of disabilities, but that should not be the only option, because somebody like me who's fully functional, who just happens to use a wheelchair, wants to live out and about in the community regularly. So we need other options, but no one's talking about it. No, everyone can live in an accessible home, but 56% of Rhode Islanders cannot live in a home or a unit that's not accessible. And it's not an if, it's a when. We all become disabled at some point. I would like to go and visit every one of you. If your homes were accessible, that would be an option, but it's not an option when nothing is made accessible and there's no visitability as well either. What are we doing about accessibility?
Yeah, so I don't want to come across as being transactional. Tina, your question is is spot on. We actually have one what we call emerging opportunity in our pipeline that would create critical mass of accessible units for elderly folks. And if we can execute the vision the way we'd like, it would be combined with a another project that would provide, you know, sort of traditional affordable housing for LMI folks. But the first phase of this project would, in fact, be for elderly residents, and it would be an accessible project, right? We're not quite there yet, but it's a very significant emerging opportunity in our development pipeline.
Well, the one thing that we have to stop and get out of our thing that accessible housing shouldn't be just for the elderly. We did a study, my organization did a study 2 years ago, and the majority of people in the state of Rhode Island using a mobility aid is between 25 and 45. They would not fit in the elderly housing, nor do they want to be in with elderly housing. That we need to think about the younger population. Accessible housing is for everybody. We need to stop thinking about it as being white and hospital looking, because that's not what it is. I mean, you can go on my website and see my house. You wouldn't even know the accessibility until I was in it with you. We need to stop building accessible housing for everyone across the board. Every unit we're building should have accessibility in mind from the get-go, because it would be easier and more affordable to change it over to accessible, to add a ramp on the front or something if we needed to, if the doorways and the bathrooms and everything else were already built from the get-go in every unit we're building. That's what I don't understand, why we're not building it as standard for accessibility instead of trying to retrofit things later.
Yeah, really good points, Tina. And I know, as Rep. Speakman put in the chat, that Rep. Spears and Rep. Stewart had great bills on accessibility and visibility this session, she noted, and definitely something to keep talking about. I'll also note that Rhode Island Housing has public comment period for the state QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, open right now. They recently added 2 points, a few points for additional accessibility requirements for affordable housing. Definitely worth, if people are also, if have Tina or others have questions about accessible housing, definitely encourage responding in the public comment to that. So definitely worth that. Want to make sure to get to some other questions. Thank you, Tina, for raising accessibility. Really appreciate it. Ed Crosby had a question. Is there a ratio or good mix rule of thumb for what percent of your total housing stock should be affordable, mixed income, market rate?
I think that's, yeah, I can jump in, but I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts as well. I think from my perspective, there really isn't a rule that you can use. You really have to look at your community and what the range of incomes is, and set targets based on that. And then I would also just want to underline that it really is important to have all three, and that um, a lot of research coming out of my center in the last few years does show that having that higher end of the income spectrum is important to bringing costs down across the board. Otherwise, you have the highest income households occupying units that really could be more affordable to middle and low income households. And that interrupts the market in ways that have repercussions for everyone.
Anyone else have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, Claudia's right that there isn't an accepted standard, as it were, but there has been a goal, right, in a lot of, you know, Hope 6 and Choice Neighborhoods funded projects of a third low income, a third moderate income, and a third fully market rate. You know, the outcomes have played themselves out, right, a little bit differently, but that has at least been a goal in a lot of Hope 6 and Choice Neighborhoods funded projects around the country.
I just wanted to mention, I know Claudia gave kind of a formal definition earlier about, mixed income, meaning that you're looking at potentially some middle and some market rate as well as affordable. But and I think that's true, but I think we can also recognize the positive element of even having a mix of incomes within an affordable development. When the whole discussion about concentration of poverty and say with public housing, a lot of times the vast majority of tenants would be very low and extremely low income. But with, most recently in the last few years with the tax credit program, there's now something that can be done called income averaging, where you can have some number of, say, 80% AMI units and averaged out with some lower income units. So, in some of the urban and lower income communities, 80% of AMI in certain neighborhoods could be above kind of what's the middle income for those neighborhoods. And 80% in this area for a family of four, we're talking about over $90,000. So when you talk about in some low-income communities, if you have a number of people at that level living in the community, that is a difference from, that's not, to me, concentration of poverty. And I think that's one positive way to get at this with affordable developments as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Peter, about what are we saying when we say mixed income? We can also talk about mixing incomes under 80% AMI, and especially thinking about when need is at the lowest, thinking about permanent supportive housing mixed, which is for the extremely low income individuals or individuals earning extremely low incomes, with mixing at different affordable levels. Really appreciate that insight and thinking about that too. So as we're nearing 9:30, really appreciate all of the questions, and clearly there's a lot on this topic. So appreciate all of our panelists and all of you for your time, insight, and expertise this morning. We really appreciate having you all at Fresh Fridays. We hope you will consider joining us at a future Fresh Fridays. We will be taking the summer off, and we will be having our next Fresh Friday in September. Please note that as you exit the Zoom meeting this morning, a brief survey about today's event will pop up in your browser on your device. It'll ask you for feedback about today's session. Please take a minute or two to respond. It'll help us continue to provide engaging and helpful experiences at Fresh Fridays in the future. Hope you have a great Friday and hope you have a great summer. Thank you all.
Thanks, Allie.